Welcome, everybody, to the August session of the Neglected Books Publisher Spotlight. This month, we're going to be focusing on the British Library Women Writers series, and in particular on Sally and the Rocks by Winifred Boggs. And with us, we have as a special guest the curator of the series, the guy who has the wonderful job of picking the titles, or at least proposing the titles, and providing fascinating afterwards and also historical context for the title, Simon Thomas. Simon, of course, has for a long time had a wonderful book blog, Stuck in a Book, and also a podcast, Tea and Books. So he's got a big fan club out there and following. And I think certainly there's been tremendous response to the series, which is absolutely, responding to an area that a lot of readers seem to be interested in, the work of women writers, and particularly mid-century, first half of the century women writers. So before we get into discussion, I want to take a few minutes to talk about, Simon mentioned in his afterword, and in fact, any discussions of Sally and the Rocks often comes to the point that there is so little known about Winifred Boggs. And so I saw that as a challenge. And so I actually dug up some interesting things about Winifred Boggs. So I thought we would start with a little discussion, a presentation about that. And then we'll jump into the discussion. So if you'll bear with me. Sorry. Okay, so Winifred Boggs. I dug a little bit into Ancestry.com and came up with a few things. So she was born in 1874. She was born in the Merseyside area. At the time, it was part of Cheshire. Now it's part of Merseyside. Very interesting. She was born in a town called Cloughton, and then her family moved to a town called Otten, saving two letters off of their envelopes. And she never married. So on the 1911 census, she's shown as living at home. Now, she did actually move to London and lived in London until her death, but so there she is. She's listed as single, living with her mother and two other daughters at that time, two sisters at the time. And what I find fascinating is she put down her profession as novelist. And one rarely saw that in census, even today, I'm sure, but at that time. So that's sort of a bold statement on her part, because at that point, she had only published a few books. So Sally and the Rocks came out, and it actually did quite well. This was published in both the UK and the US, and it was republished in several cheap editions. So this is a relatively cheap edition that came out after the book was originally published from her publisher, Herbert Jenkins. And you can see there's quite a lot of other titles on there. What's interesting is if you look two down from Sally and the Rocks, you'll find another title that she wrote under the pseudonym of Edward Burke. So as I mentioned, Sally and the Rocks got quite good reviews. A lot of comparisons to Elizabeth Gaskell's novel Cranford, and we can talk about that a little bit because it's certainly an apt comparison. If you've read Cranford or you've seen the wonderful BBC series, it has to resonate with some of the characters, particularly Maggie in Sally and the Rocks. I love the kind of reviews you saw back 100 years ago weren't always say this as tactful. So I love this. Better than the sale of Lady Daventry. So you don't know if that means that the other book was considerably worse than this one. I mean, it's not really a fair point of comparison. And yeah, it was published in the U.S. And Brentano's, which back in those days, Brentano's in particular was a very big and popular bookstore in New York City, but also a publisher. But she published a number of books. Many of them are now tough to find. A number of her books are, in fact, excuse me, if you're participating, could you put yourself on mute so we don't pick up background noise? So these are jackets from a few of her titles. Some of her titles are essentially unobtainable. They're not for sale, used by anybody. You have to go to the registry library. So places like the British Library, the National Library of Scotland, Trinity College in Dublin. Those are the only places you will find copies of some of her books. There are a number of her books that are available if you are able to use the Internet Archive. That's available. And I also mentioned that if you haven't read Sally and the Rocks and you're interested in audiobooks, there is I listened to the LibriVox recording or part of it after reading it. It's really an outstanding reading of the book. So if you like audiobooks, I'd highly recommend, I'd say much more highly than the average LibriVox reading. I listened to the first chapter. It was wonderful. So she also used a number of pseudonyms. One of them was Gloria Manning. I'm flagging this one because just from looking at the review in the New York Times back from when this came out, Improper Prue, it sounds like a great candidate for another one to look at. If you look at it here, she's rare freedom of manner, a rather more freedom of manner than young ladies are generally supposed to have, even very up-to-date young ladies. So that's, Simon can probably tell you that when you're looking for these kind of forgotten books, it's a phrase like that in a review that often sets off the radar tones that says, okay, if the reviewer, this is probably much more case of the reviewer not understanding the book and having perhaps not the right perspective to appreciate the book. To me, I read a statement like that and I think, oh, I would want to read that. I want to find out, why did they have that sort of adverse reaction to it? So a number of other books. So she had actually her Edward Burke books did very well, in some ways better than many of her own novels, particularly Bachelor's Buttons. This was one that I found online. My wife, and I love this because you can see here from just looking at the table of contents, you can see that she possessed a tremendous ability to get herself into the male mindset. So this is, how wives are so untidy, how wives are such cowards, how wives train daughters disgracefully, how wives prefer to be misunderstand, etc. So you can see it's very much a satire on the male mindset of that time, but it looks like it's a lot of fun. She did have one of her books that was filmed called The Price of Possession. Unfortunately, this film, you can find shots and ads from the film, but the film itself is considered a lost film. So this is one of those that the whatever copies there were have become untraceable, and nobody's, unfortunately, you're not in a position to view it online. And then in 1931, she died. She was well known enough that she did get a few obituaries, but again, pointing out the fact that many people knew her better by her Edward Burke books. So she died. She was living in Hampstead at that time. And in fact, she's buried in the Hampstead Cemetery. So if you want to track down, I don't have a photo of her grave, but it's there. And if you if you're a big Winifred Boggs fan and you want to find her grave, you can contact the management of the cemetery and find out exactly where it is. So there it is. She was buried in 1931, and she left an estate of about 3,000 pounds, which was pretty respectable for a not powerfully best-selling author of those days. So that meant that she was certainly able to make a living and have enough to tide some cash away. And then I mentioned this. So there's very little information about her, but I stumbled across in the Internet Archive this book by Andrew Ewell, Graham Ewell, Memoirs of a Journalist, where apparently he was a distant relative. His grandmother was a Boggs, and he became fascinated by her because his mother had some of her books. And so he was able to track down, in the 1980s, he was able to track down a little more information than any of us have seen today. So I've shared that with Simon, and for whatever reason, whatever purpose we might have in future, there are a few more data points about Winifred Boggs, thanks to this article. And with that, I will stop this. Actually, I do want to one more thing, which is to mention, hopefully you're all aware that this is just one of now 16 titles that are available as of next month.
I think we're up to 20 now. 20 now.
20 now, okay. Which is pretty amazing. Believe me, since I'm doing this myself, the same sort of thing, that's a stunning production rate for this kind of work. So this has all been masterminded by Simon with tremendous support from the folks at the British Library Publishing Function. And so I hope we'll have a chance not just to talk about Sally on the Rocks, but also to talk about the series. So if you don't mind, I'm going to invite Simon to jump in and give us a little talk about the genesis of the series, and then how you came across Sally and the Rocks, and the process of, and some thoughts about the responses to the books so far.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for all that information. Lots of things I didn't know about Winifred Boggs. It was so interesting. One of the interesting things I spotted is you had Improper Prue there by Gloria Manning, and I have Improper Prue but with Winifred Boggs' name on the cover. So she obviously published it under two names, and
Wow.
it is
Well, that must have been the English edition.
Yeah. She obviously maybe they didn't think Boggs would go down well in America. I don't know. Yes, I'm so glad that everyone's here to talk more about this wonderful book and this series. And I guess unlike some of the people who've been talking in this series over the year, I have the sort of fortunate position that I have no financial stake in how well the series does, or need to do any of the sort of hard work. Really, I get to do the fun stuff of reading and suggesting books, and then writing the afterwards and that sort of thing. And it started, people might well know the British Library Crime Classics series that started a few years before this series started, and has been a tremendous success and publishes at an extraordinary rate. They seem to be publishing new books every week. And it had done so well that the British Library were looking at other I guess areas or types of book that they could launch series about, and they did a sci-fi series. I think there's been others, but one of them was women writers. And the lady who was originally in charge of that, she actually left the British Library before the series launched, but she was the one who went to the, I guess, the editorial board and other people with this proposal. Was someone who read my blog and knew my podcast and knew that I had an interest in this area and had done research in this area. And so she just emailed me saying, would you like to chat more about this, to try and put together a proposal? Initially, I just thought it was spam or something, or it seemed too good to be true. It seemed like I was going to be kidnapped or something if I replied to it. But I thought, well, what's the worst that can happen? I'll say yes. And we had a wonderful chat where she talked through the idea of the series, which initially was, I think, lent much more into the decades idea. Anyone who's looked at copies will see that there are those lists at the beginnings that will talk about things that were happening in the 1920s, 1930s, whichever decade it was published in. Originally, that was much more prominent part of the idea, and that sort of faded slightly as the proposal developed. But yeah, her question to me was essentially, are there books by women writers about women's lives that you think should be reprinted that have been neglected? And of course, my answer was absolutely yes. And did not take long for me to give a whole list of ideas. It was very slow moving from then to it eventually happening. I think about 2 years between that and the first book coming out. And the series launched in March 2020, which was a terrible time to launch something as all bookshops shut because of the pandemic, particularly since most of the authors that we publish are not well known at all, and some of them are well known, like Elizabeth von Arnim or E.M. Delafield, to a certain sort of reader. But people like Winifred Boggs, we're really just relying on people seeing copies of the books in bookshops and thinking those look interesting. So yeah, we were very grateful that it managed to still do okay, have still had support from enough people who keep their eye on that sort of thing online, and it's still going now 3.5 years later, which I'm very grateful for. I'm still sort of waiting for any moment them to say, actually, let's stop. But thankfully they haven't, and they still seem very behind and very enthused by the series. And I've certainly got lots more books that I'd like to suggest. Should I talk about this particular book, how I came across
Sure.
it?
Well, sure. I mean, just a little bit about, are there any titles that you would love to do, but you haven't been able to because of a rights issue or some other aspect of it? Or have you been able to score goals pretty regularly?
Yeah, most of the ones I suggest have worked out well. The ones that haven't have been less because of rights issues and more because the other, so the editor at the British Library and the team don't want to do it, basically. And some of those because they didn't quite fit the series. I would love us to do an Ivy Compton Burnett, but because she didn't really write about the period that she was publishing in, those don't really fit. Because whilst we're not so wedded to the decade thing, the idea is that the book should reflect women's lives in the period that the book was published. So
So
historical fiction is
contemporary, there's a
sort of
contemporary
that.
aspect
Yeah,
of it. That's interesting.
yeah. And there was some that were more sort of autobiographical fiction that they were thought to lean a little to autobiography. I would love to do My Sister Eileen by Ruth McKenney. It's a wonderful book with two wonderful films of it. And the one that does fit all our criteria, and the reason we didn't do it was just because the editorial team didn't like it, was that Joyce Dennis's Economy Must Be Our Watchword, which has a very ill-fated journey to publication in that it was turned down by the British Library. It was then going to be part of the Forward Middlebrow series, and sadly that series has ended. So it keeps, getting closer and closer to being published and not yet published. But I think it's a wonderful, wonderful book. Just the rest of the team don't agree with me. One that almost didn't happen is one that actually just got published by Angela Milne 1 year's time, which was in catalogs, I think probably a year or so ago. And in the end, we had to pull it because we couldn't find the family. And then, as a last-ditch effort, I just put on my blog, which I didn't expect to come to anything. Does anyone have any connection with Angela Milne's family? She's the niece of A.A. Milne, so I thought there must be somebody. And another blogger got in touch and said that her cousin had once commented on her blog, and she still had his email address, and so we contacted him. She's dead, but her children, who are quite elderly themselves, are still alive, and he put us in touch with them, and we eventually got the rights, and it came out. Because I mean,
Right.
I know there is, some publishers are a bit more gung-ho in terms of, if we did our best and we'll put it out, and there's a legitimacy to that, and you can set up a fund thing with the government to make sure that you'll know about this, to hold funds if names do come out. But the British Library are a bit more cautious, I think, than some publishers.
Okay. So let's talk about Sally and the Rocks. How did you come up across the book?
Well, I've mentioned Furrowed Middlebrow, and I'm sure many people know Scott's wonderful blog, Furrowed Middlebrow. And something that I do when I'm trying to get ideas for more authors to pursue is go through his wonderful resource of listing basically every women writer in Britain and Ireland between 1900 and 1960, I think it is. And sometimes it's just got a few details, sometimes a bit more. And I was just going through thinking, oh, what jumps out? Is there anything here I should look up? And quite often have bought books if they look interesting. And I think the book that actually jumped out at me, which I do have here, was on your screen, was The Indignant Spinsters, because I just thought, what a wonderful title. Sadly, a fairly mediocre book. It's okay. It's not brilliant. But it's certainly not as good as Sally on the Rocks. And it was very hard to get that one, but I was so drawn to that title, and I thought that's the sort of title that could sell as well. But it was much easier to get secondhand copies of Sally on the Rocks. So I thought, I'll buy Sally on the Rocks whilst I wait for copies to appear. I'll keep searching for others. And I did. I think I bought Sally on the Rocks before The Indignant Spinsters. I think I read The Indignant Spinsters first, even though it came a few months later when it finally did turn up, and I spent too much money on it. But then I thought, well, this is fine. It's not great. It's okay. But now I've got Sally on the Rocks. I'll try that one too. And almost immediately, I was so drawn into, as you said, that quite Cranfordy world. I loved the characters so quickly. I fell in love with Sally so quickly. I hated Miss Mally so quickly. And yeah, as soon as I finished it, I emailed Alison, the editorial contact I have at the British Library, saying, I think this is a really special book. I think we should do this. And she, obviously, the great thing about them working at the British Library is they can call up any book that's been published in the UK. So they did that, and they loved it too. So it was quite a short period between me reading it for the first time and it coming out. Some of the books I've suggested for the series have been books that I've loved for 20 years or something, but some of them are ones that I read actively searching for more content for the series.
Right. Do you find that, having this role in the series, that now that you feel like the hunt is always on?
It is, and if I lean to the side, my mantelpiece there is basically books that could be future titles. So if I buy a book by a woman that I don't recognize the name, or if they're not in print, they go on that shelf. And so when I'm looking for a new book, I just sort of pick something more or less at random from that shelf and think, what could this be? Yeah, and I mean, it's sort of a balance, because the British Library are also quite keen to sprinkle in some better known names. So I think I'd be excited about finding the completely unknown people, whereas they are more, that's great, but also, Elizabeth von Arnim is a name that people want more books by, for example. So
Right.
yeah, it's sort of a mix. I'm sure that's true of many of these people doing similar endeavors. So yeah, I mean, but to be honest, the search for little known women writers was already something I did most of the time whilst book shopping. So it hasn't felt much of a change of pace.
Now you've kind of moved out of a little bit beyond the furrowed middlebrow Persephone kind of territory with some of your more recent titles, Penelope Mortimer and Elizabeth Barrage. Do you see yourself looking more into the 60s and 70s? Because personally, I think 60s, 70s, 80s, that if you're talking about untapped potential, I mean, I have at least a shelf and a half of, forgotten British women writers from that period that, I haven't had the time to get to, but it seems like the potential there is tremendous. Do you have an aspiration to go down that path?
The series certainly has that aspiration, and the British Library are very keen to do that. I will say it's not my comfort zone. So my PhD is in interwar literature. My reading tastes are in interwar literature. I know a lot more about a huge amount more, in as much as I know very little about post-war literature. So when those two came, when they said quite deliberately, we'd like something from the 60s and something from the 70s, what can you suggest? And at that point, I said, I honestly I don't know anything off the top of my head, but I'll go away and read. Those Elizabeth Barrage, I'd read the short stories that Persephone do, and I'd read one other called Rose. What's it called? Something about roses. And I knew that I quite liked her, so I thought quite reading Penelope Mortimer I knew I loved, and was quite surprised that there were books of hers that weren't available anywhere. I mean, the home was surprisingly hard to find. I mean, you could find it with relatively easy, but there weren't that many copies around, which did surprise me for being in many ways a spiritual sequel to an incredibly popular book, The Pumpkin Eater, which is in print in all sorts of places. So yeah, I mean, and they're keen to keep doing that, and I am certainly happy to help them. But it's an area where I feel more that I'm starting from scratch. I was also aware, because I write these lists of dates at the front, interesting things going on. And afterwards, I often talk about contemporary things happening in women's lives in the period. I was aware that a lot of the readers would remember the 70s, and so I felt greater urgency to get it right. So I was born in the mid 1980s, so it's like it's all before my lifetime, but it's but plenty of the readers were born in the 40s, 50s, 60s, so they I felt like I probably couldn't hide in the same way that I could if I was saying things about the 1910s.
Do you get select suggestions from readers that you've been able to take advantage of, or you're still on mostly your own resources?
We haven't really, and I'd love them. I really, really would love to get suggestions, but people tend to suggest things that are already in print, which is a bit of a shame. They might not be that popular, but things that are already out there, or they'll
Right.
suggest things that don't quite fit, their historical fiction, or their sometimes by men. And I don't think there are any examples of things that people have suggested to me that I've read and said, oh, they're not good enough or something. I just haven't really had, or we will say something like, you should do a Marjorie Sharp, and I'd love to do a Marjorie Sharp, but all the really good ones have already been done. So,
Yeah, right.
yeah, so yeah, it's if anyone on the call today has any suggestions for books that they love by women and about women, that's another crucial thing, is that people, I don't think people always spot that necessarily about the series, as they can't just be by women, they have to be about women as well. So there are some great books, but they're about men, and that's not what the series is about.
Well, I'm reading one now that you might take a look at. I'll send it. It's called Fortune Grass. It's a memoir, actually. Fortune Grass by a woman named Mabel Lethbridge, who volunteered. Well, she first she worked as a nurse, and then she worked as a munitions worker, and was injured. She lost her leg and was severely wounded in one of the explosions they had at arms factories, because it was incredibly dangerous work in World War I, particularly. And then she just kept on going. So she just she just hobbled onto a bus and went across town and got herself a secretarial job, because she was just dead set on not sitting at home idle. So, and that's just this is like 3/4 of the way into the book. There's more adventures yet to come for her, and it's very accessible and very, very candid, funny writing. So that's one I would certainly.
Interesting.
I had to pick one off the top of my head, and that's partly because I'm reading it right now.
Yeah, sadly we don't do memoirs, but I would like to read it nonetheless, because I've suggested a few memoirs that we can't do, but it sounds fascinating. And I will say, actually, I should say, Scott from Forward Middleborough, after that series sadly finished, did very kindly send me some ideas that they were going to have in the future. So, and I've not read them yet, but I think this could be some. I mean, Scott's taste is impeccable, so yeah, I'm hoping there are some of those things he suggests that potentially, yeah.
Okay. Well, let's open it up for folks if they have questions or comments or thoughts about Sally on the Rocks. Hopefully, we've got some folks here who've read it and have some reactions to it. If you'll just go off mute, I think we can all be well behaved enough that we won't jump in at the same time. And if not, don't mind if I shut you off and just do a little moderation here.
Well, Brad.
Yes.
Yes. I will jump into something, but I will feel free to not take up a lot of time. But Simon, we did the Dorothy Richardson pilgrimage 13 chapter volumes with Brad last year, and I'm with one of the participants working through it again at a much slower pace. But I found it, having just reread the first of her books, Pointed Roofs, and then jumping into Sally on the Rocks, a very kind of interesting overlay of basically Dorothy's character, quasi Perry autobiographical, Miriam Henderson, is in the same boat, as so to speak, as Sally on the Rocks, and is writing at the same time. That was published in 1915 as well. And I thought it was really interesting to see a more conventional take on the situation in Winifred Boggs, which I loved. I thought it was very amusing, and then to see how a modernist trailblazer, awful word, would take the same situation and turn it into something else. So I just found it would be really a good pairing if you were going to have some kind of a literary critical discussion on this era and women and writing. So I don't know where to go with that, but that's just the thing that hit me a lot. So
Great, yeah. I mean, I haven't actually read anything by Dorothy Richardson, so I'm not equipped to
Oh,
comment. But
yeah.
fascinating.
That-
I do
Yeah,
have
you-
the
back
first
in
couple
in
volumes,
2025, I'm planning to do another year reading group of pilgrimage. So we go through basically one book a month, which makes it manageable.
yeah.
I'm a huge Dorothy Richardson pilgrimage booster, because she is such a remarkable writer. But as Phillips points out, it is an interesting contrast in many ways, in my opinion at least. Winifred Boggs is drawing upon very heavily on a lot of 19th century conventions in the novel. In structure, in setting, and all of this. So it was almost like, if it weren't for World War I happening in the background, you could put this story anywhere between 1840 and 1930 maybe.
Another
you know-
author that resonated with the Winifred side of things for me was Stella Gibbons, who I did a little piece for Brad's blog about, who wrote many books after her most well-known, and had that same kind of quirky female outsider, observer, black-eyed sort of take on men and stuff like that. I don't know if you've read much of her, but there's just this feeling of the women in that era were right on the verge. They knew what they didn't have, and they weren't quite, they didn't have enough power to fully act on it. So they took the role of the conquered race, right? I mean, the sort of colonial, watching the masters going and taking them apart in their minds, since they can't take them apart financially. So I just love that kind of conspiratorial feeling that you get from Winifred and Stella. Yeah.
It's just a comment I want to pass on, that one of the things about pilgrimage is how much you learn about dentistry in those days. And that is actually one of the things I love about pilgrimage is one of the things that Miriam Henderson, the character in Pilgrimage, does is she goes to work. I mean, she's a working woman throughout the whole book. She is a working woman because her family, or her father, like Richardson's father, was a bankrupt. And so the prospects of this, comfortable middle-class family being able to, actually, if you recall from this, the shot I showed of the 1911 census, it had next to her mother's name, in terms of occupation, it says private means, which is what census takers reported when someone in those days had essentially enough family capital saved up that they didn't have to work. So anyway, she goes to work in a dentist's office, and it does go into there's at least one chapter that is nothing more than following Miriam through the day as she's going from dentist to dentist to the lab downstairs and doing all that stuff. So yes, and actually, if you participate in that group, we learned from one of the scholars that we invited that Dorothy Richardson herself, at one of the first writing jobs she had, was writing a little column for an English dentistry magazine.
Wow. Well, to answer Jill's
So we
question,
got
I
off
haven't,
track there, but
yeah, I haven't seen a lot about dentistry. Although I mean, the nearest I can get is Dangerous Ages by Rose Macaulay, which is from 1920 something, which has a lot about being a female doctor in the 1920s. And there's a lot, she's trying to get back into working as a doctor after having raised children. And that feels incredibly modern. And I mean, a lot about Freudianism is there. So you get as well, someone basically starts going to a psychoanalysis just because it's the only man she can find who'll listen to her, which I appreciated. And yeah, Phyllis, I love Stella Gibbons. I say I love Stella. I think she's one of the most variable authors. Some of them are truly dreadful, but Miss Lindsay in Power is one of my favorites. I think that's absolutely wonderful. But sadly, too much racism in it to probably to get the British Library to do it. That's probably why it's one of the ones that hasn't been touched by some other reprint publishers. But yeah, I think there is that. That's an interesting one on class as well. And what you're saying about the sort of camaraderie, one of the things I really liked about Sally and the Rocks, that, you know, as Brad says, it in some ways it could be set anytime in the 19th century, but it felt so modern in that central love triangle where the two women aren't fighting each other and they don't hate each other. They basically say, let the best woman win. We both recognize that Mr. Bingley, obviously a nod to the 19th century as well, is rich but awful, and we both know that. Well, he's not even super rich, but he's their best chance at a secure future. And I think it would feel quite fresh now to have a love triangle where two women weren't fighting over a man, but were sort of comrades in arms who saying best woman win. And that's something really fresh I really liked about the book.
Yeah. There's a Depression era song, sisters, never were there such devoted sisters.
Yes,
Lord help the sister that comes between me and my man. Lord help them. So there was a take on that. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I love that she called him
I think one
Mr.
of the
Bingley.
things that certainly the collaboration is an interesting, but I almost feel like, I mean, frankly, the moment that Robert Cantee shows up, I knew the ending, and it's partly because I've read enough 19th century, three-decker novels that I knew, of course, he was the Deus ex machina. He was the guy who was going to allow her to escape the triangle, in fact.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where, it's, as you say, it fits right in with the standard plot at that point. But I think personally, I love the vivacity of Sally so much. I didn't want her to be crushed. I was happy for the book to have that sort of get out ending.
I didn't want her to go to Canada, though.
Well, as I've said, there should be a sequel, Sally on the Rockies. So
Winnipeg, Sally.
Well, I mean, just from a dramatic standpoint, if he didn't show up, it really would be very difficult to resolve that book, because we all know she's going to be miserable with Bingley. And we also know enough about what's going on with her competitor, so to speak, to know that actually, very early on we learned that, my gosh, we really do want this woman to get married because she needs the security as much or more, because she has a daughter, of course, so she has a dependent.
And also, I mean, just that genius thing, and you mentioned this in your afterward, Simon, but of having Miss Maggie be the one that tells us this whole thing, right? She's kind of the I sing of arms and the man. I mean, there she goes. She's going to go off on her thing, but from the third full page that there's no way Sally can stay in Little Crampton. I mean, this description of those who had grasped the great adventure and laid hands upon tomorrow had reached its shimmer of golden gray, but no loving tongue, all this stuff. And if you came back to Little Crampton without having done anything, you were just on resignation, the dead eyes, and you were just waiting for that tide that has already gone out to never come in again. I mean, so you already know that I kind of like that in a sense. It's almost a biblical story in the sense that the story's been told to us in the first 5 pages in a way, and then we're going to see, okay, let's see what happens with all this. So I thought the structure of it, and I know that's not new, but I just enjoyed that feeling of being in good hands when I was reading this. Somebody knew what
Yes.
they were up to. Yeah, yeah.
I do have to
Yeah.
say that while I relished right at the end where Mr. Bingley goes off on Maggie, and you know, it's sort of, you know, having suffered this woman throughout the whole book, all the characters and we the readers having suffered Miss Maggie, he finally goes off on it. But I have to say, it seemed a very un-Bingley like moment.
Even he has his boiling point, apparently. Yeah, and I
Yeah.
think, I do think Miss Maggie is one of the great villains in any book I've read. Which she's, for those who've not read it, she's basically the village gossip, but with the intent, with the most power and malice that everyone is afraid of going against her because she holds their reputation in her hands. But something I did try to bring out in the afterword as well is that she just didn't really have any choice. This is the only place she could get power as a woman of her age in the 1910s. Like she'd have made a wonderful detective or a lawyer or something like that, but she just couldn't. So she just had that small world that she could rule. Yes, Constance says, yeah, he burns his mother's book as well. Or he's getting rid
Yeah,
of
I
all
mean,
of
to
the
me, that was the
powerful older
most,
women.
yeah, I mean, that's sorry, but
Prospero-esque moment.
I just can't see Bingley have gotten to the point that he would
Yeah.
give
Yeah,
his
there's a few
mother's
conveniences that yeah.
his
Along the way.
mother the oracle, you know. He had an answer
Yeah.
to every situation.
And
Although
the reason
it's
why
funny,
every
if
woman is
you actually
dreadful. Yeah.
keep track of what she's saying, it's like you can see she would never want her son to actually get married.
Right.
It's impossible.
Yeah.
Which is what Miss Maggie said in the first 3 pages of the book, too, right? I mean, she is the all-seeing one, and of course
Yeah.
her power only rests in the fact that everybody else is so conventional that they're afraid to not join in. I mean, it is really a compact made with the devil, right? Yeah.
I like Constance's point that the long night of camping out remove the veneer of courtesy. Yes, and that's my favorite scene where they're just going round and round these woods, and you're just thinking. I mean, at one point there's 13 pathways to choose from. I'm thinking, what woods have this many paths in? I don't know, but but it is wonderful that she just thinks the power of moonlight will force him to propose. But if I just answer the question that Joanne's put in the chat as well. So she says that thanks for getting more Elizabeth von Arnim and Molly Panterdown's published. I have plans to get more. Yes, wonderful. So Molly Panterdown's book was one of the few that were chosen before I came on board. They'd got 2 titles before I started, but I had read it before that, and I was pleased to get that one. Potentially more in her. I think the other ones that aren't in print with Persephone or Virago are much worse. So that, I mean, there's Stormbird and The Chase and The Shoreless Sea. And The Shoreless Sea is quite fun, and she wrote it when she was 17 or something, and it's very feels like a 17-year-old wrote it. So it's got some sort of fun novelty, very over the top feel to it. I mean, One Fine Day, her last novel is like this wonderfully subtle, brilliant depiction of a day in post-war England, and it could not be more different from that. It's very like clearly draws on all the melodramas she was reading. Elizabeth von Arnim, there is, I don't know, so we did Father, which I'm amazed has been out of print. I think it's one of her best books, and Jen is an absolutely wonderful heroine. And Introduction to Sally is either just come out or just about to come out, so that one's happening. And there are hopes of doing another one maybe next year, waiting to see which, potentially The Benefactress. But a lot of hers are actually in print with Virago, even though you wouldn't know it. So they've got quite a few that they technically still have in print, but you never see anywhere. So it gets a bit harder then to do them. But yeah, she is certainly one of the more popular authors that we've written. I think a lot of people who love her for The Enchanted April, and maybe one or two of her other books, just have no idea how prolific she was and how many books there are out there to discover, and how her quality is, very consistent. She doesn't really write a bad book, in my opinion.
The Mountain has not been reissued though, has it?
Which one, sorry?
I think it's The Mountain.
Oh, in the mountains. Yeah.
In the mountains,
Uh,
yeah.
Yeah. No, that's another possibility. For me, that's very, I mean, I do like it. I think it's a sort of weird book of two halves where they don't quite sort of make sense together, in my opinion. But and I know that people tend to love one half more than the other, or that differs which half they love. But certainly one that could well happen at some point. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's another consideration. I'm sure you've had this, which is there are books that are like that, which have some very good points and very, and I'm thinking of Gertrude Trevelyan's novel about Oxford, Hothouse, which to me would be a very wonderful, powerful 220-page book, but she published a 400-page book. And the extra 180 pages are not worth it.
And yeah, I mean, there was
you
there's
just
one.
can't do the historical text. You can't do what an editor should have done back in the original days and say, cut that, take it out, etc. Then you'd be accused of Baudelarizing it, I guess, or censoring
Yeah,
it.
there's a book called Robert and Helen by Elizabeth Jenkins that was about sort of socialism, and it brilliant book right up until the final page, and the final page is so bad that it makes everything else, it really like affects the rest of the book. So we were quite keen on doing it, but the ending is so bad that we decided not to. And yeah, similarly, like if she was alive and you should be her editor as she was writing it, you could easily turn it into a brilliant book. But now, yeah, you can't change what was published.
Yeah.
And the other thing that we have a lot of, I know that some publishers are happy just to publish books with a little, note saying this is what happened at the time. But the British Library has a very firm line about not doing anything with racism in it. If it's like a sort of, the N word or something that can just be changed to a different word and it doesn't, affect anything else, we have done that with some books. But if there's, if racism is part of the plot, or even just a very minor way, then they won't do it. There's been a few that I think these are really good books, but we just can't do it.
Well, you can see the point for a state-funded institution that you
exactly, yeah,
really
yeah.
have to. We were looking at a book called "Music in the Listening Place" by a New Zealand writer. That's just completely, which is a wonderful, wonderful book, except there's a lot of appropriation of Maori culture without, and thankfully I reached out to a scholar in New Zealand to say, look, I don't feel like this is not my comfort zone. I don't know it well enough. So please, do we have a problem here or not? And she kind of said, this is a great book, but no, you
can't.
simply cannot do this because it trods on top of numerous things that would be considered misrepresentation and cultural appropriation today.
Yeah. To answer another question in the chat about Mrs. Skeffington is one of the ones that Virago more or less has in print, so you can still buy it from the Virago website. It's just you won't find it in a bookshop.
Yeah, there are Virago. I've exchanged a number of emails with Donna Coonan, who runs the Virago list, and because I was mainly interested in why pilgrimage is so darn hard to get a hold of. And yeah, they have a lot of properties that they are pretty much just sitting on.
Yeah.
Copyright camping, so to speak. So they have it, it's in print technically, but it's not available in stores. And they just keep their inventory. And what's ironic is it's obvious if you get one of their books that they're using print on demand technology, which means these could be available. But for whatever reason, I think they are much more focused on their current fiction list, their current publishing, and they're just not, so there's actually much more of the modern classics list that is technically still available and in print, but it is not being sold at all. It's not marketed at all, which is a real shame considering what a profound impact that has had from a cultural
Mm.
standpoint.
And there are some, like, so I mentioned earlier, Appendice, The Peep Show by F. Tennyson Jesse, that had been a Virago modern classic, but when they reprinted it, there was a sort of slightly strange thing where F. Tennyson Jesse left her literary rights to someone during their life, and then it would go to these two charities. So they reprinted it while this I can't remember who she was, but this other one was still alive, so they could just contact her, and that was fine. They could print it. And then after she died, the copyright split between, I think it was the RSPCA and the NSPCC, which became, charities don't tend to deal with publishing rights, and so they don't have people who are in charge of that, and I think just didn't want the issue of dealing with it. But our wonderful rights people managed to persuade them, because I believe Virago Modern Classics had tried to do that themselves. They wanted to bring it back into print and had not been able to. I'd seen, in fact, Duna, I think, commented on that on Twitter at one point. So I was so happy that the wonderful people, the rights team, managed to get that, because I think it's a really brilliant and quite important book. I think it's a good argument that it's the best book that we have in our British Library Women Writers series. It's not my favorite, but I think there is probably a line of argument that it's the best one that we do. And we just need, an ITV drama or something, and then it'll do really well.
She didn't. It's somewhat unique in her oeuvre, because she did a lot about trials and crimes, but not in a novelistic way. So there was some people may know that there was a series that came out in I guess the 30s mostly, the famous British trials. I forget the actual name of it, but
notable British trials.
Yeah, something like that. It was there were dozens of titles, and she wrote probably at least 6 or 7 of them. And but they were very historically accurate, so to speak. So they're the sort of thing that they're fascinating as a record of the trial. Not really so much as they're certainly not works of fiction in any way. And they're certainly, they're just, that's an area of nonfiction that doesn't age well, unfortunately, I think.
And that series actually did cover the Thompson Bywaters trial. Just she didn't write that particular book, but I did manage to look at it when I was writing. And something I really like actually about that, so for people who don't know the Thompson Bywaters trial, the novel is very heavily based on, even though it says in the intro that the characters are not based on any real people, they very much are. Was this trial where a woman was having an affair with a younger man, who then stabbed that. Was it stabbed? I forget which is real and which is the book, but he killed that woman's husband. And even though she may well not have known it was going to happen or be involved in it, she and the murderer both hanged for the murder, which E.M. Delafield, who was also in the British Library series and was well known for French Lady, also based a novel on it called Messalina of the Suburbs. And it's really interesting to read those alongside each other, because whilst both of them sort of sympathise with the Edith character, F. Tennyson Jesse does it in a sort of, this woman, whilst working class, was obviously much more intelligent than everyone else around her, was obviously uniquely brilliant, and E.M. Delafield's much more, she was an ordinary woman caught up in this strange world. And I think it's not as good a book, I think, probably is fair to say, but it's a very enjoyable book. And their interpretations are very different. And E.M. Delafield's was much earlier. It was just 2 years after the trial took place, and F. Tennyson Jesse's was 12 years after it took place.
Yeah. Well, we're coming up on the hour. I want to take a moment just to look ahead, to let folks know what we have coming up in our this ongoing series. So if you'll bear with me for a moment, just to look ahead. So next month, this is a very, sorry that didn't come out, but next month on the 28th of September, we're going to be talking to a very new entry into this reissuing business, Modern Times Publishing, talking about a novel from the 1920s by Babette Deutsch called Mask of Silenus. It's about the death of Socrates. And then on the 31st, so on Halloween, we're going to be talking with Wakefield Press, which if you're into avant-garde stuff, particularly surrealism, they've done a phenomenal job. Most of their stuff is actually translation work. So this is actually a translation from the Danish a very odd, they have a number of the books in their canon, or their catalog like this, which is, there was a fascination with like Nick Carter crime novel adventure stories, Jules Verne sort of things that the surrealists picked up and sort of adapted. And this is one of those, Cresadoc, the Onion Man. So I haven't gotten my copy, but this one looks like it's a lot of fun. And then in October, some of you have mentioned The Caravanners by Elizabeth von Arnhem. This was issued by Handheld Press. So Kate McDonald from Handfield. She picked a much more recent book, a biography of a woman named Hilda Matheson. This book was coming out from Handheld this month. And then the end of the year, we're going to be talking about Kathleen Farrell's Mistletoe Malice, which is coming from Faber, Ella Griffith's reissue series. So if you want to follow these, you can just follow Neglected Books on Eventbrite, and you will be able to know when things are coming up. And also, I make these things known on Twitter and all the social media platforms. So if you like these things, you like these discussions, please join us. We're going to be doing some more, and it's just an opportunity to highlight the remarkable work that is going on. If you think about, I mean, Simon, you can say for yourself, if we go back 20 years, it was a pretty barren field. Virago was starting to taper off. And I think Persephone was just starting. And there weren't a lot. New York Review Books Classics hadn't started. So we have an amazing number of books that were extraordinarily hard to find that are now coming out and being available. And to me, what I like about this is, I like to say literature is a landscape. You don't have to just take the expressways through literature and hit the most popular writers and best known books. There's lots of wonderful stuff out there. But of course, if the only place you can find it, and we're bringing a book next year that literally the only copies are in the British Library, and 3 or 4 copies worldwide. People just aren't going to read that book. Even scholars, honestly, don't read books if they have to work that hard to go find them, frankly. So Simon, thank you so much for joining us. And thank everybody for participating. It's a wonderful series, and it's great to hear that it looks like it's got a good future, as long as it's meeting the mission objectives of the British Library and not losing money. And I don't imagine it is, because they seem to be flying off the shelf. At least many of them are really resounding or responding to what readers are looking for today. So thank you, everybody, and I will be making this available on YouTube, and I hope you sign up for next month's discussion.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.